Well, I want to make one more video, and I don't know if you've heard this yet, but certainly it is what they would call a generational event. And that is this whole thing about what looks like an early release of a Supreme Court decision to, I don't know if the word is overturn, but I think it's more appropriate to say, in this case, undermine the Roe v. Wade decision and therefore allow the states to set their own abortion policies. And I find this to be really an earth-shattering thing because a lot of what was said in the argument that was posted on the internet today, which apparently was written by either Alito or one of his clerks, is that Roe versus Wade never had any really sound fundamental law behind it. I take it that it should never have been done. The Constitution does not provide any kind of protection for abortions. All the these things, and it's really interesting because yes, we did have a lot of talk about Roe versus Wade when every justice on that court was appointed or going through hearings in the Senate and then appointed. But at the same time, we all knew, everybody's known, and I think for a while now, this growing division between red states and blue states on a number of these fundamental constitutional issues. And I would say they're not even really constitutional issues. You could argue they're logical and moral issues that are playing themselves out as constitutional issues when really the Constitution is one thing, the interpretation of the Constitution is another thing, and people argue about this all day long, but in my opinion, you don't have to agree with me. I'm not going to get into an argument with anyone about this. All I'm saying is the Constitution is a piece of paper on which words have been written and signatures applied. Okay, it is not law in and of itself. You can say whatever you want to say about that. There's got to be the law and the Constitution, and they are two different things. Second, in my experience with the law, the judiciary tends to implement the decisions of the legislature whenever there's any question about what a law means. They refer to legislative intent, and that's hardly the only resolution method that the courts have when it comes to resolving issues of law and deciding for or against a plaintiff in a judicial action. But I think it's interesting, and I think that we have to skip a lot of this middle ground stuff. Kavanaugh saying that when asked whether he respects Roe versus Wade, he says, it's the law of the land. I respect the law of the land. Yes, I respect it. And it's like, that's not the answer to the question that was posed to him. And people are like pulling all these videos out and stuff like that. Roe versus Wade is not a law. Roe versus Wade is a decision about a case brought before the Supreme Court on appeal about a case in the lower courts that is possibly or largely to one degree or another based upon or writing upon a question of the interpretation of laws and their constitutionality. Again, what is the intent or meaning or the effect of what's written in the Constitution is entirely up to the courts, the legislative bodies, and the people, and the executive branch to decide. That's why we have all these cases going through appeals court and going up in front of the Supreme Court, because people do not agree on what the law should be or what should or should not be constitutional. And this decision effectively brought this out. It brought this out wide and open. It's a mistake for the Supreme Court to try to slap a decision on this issue and enforce it down the throats of all the states and try to solve this problem for everyone. And that's kind of ridiculous because that's exactly what the Supreme Court does. It resolves, that's its point, is to resolve these judicial issues. That is why we have a Supreme Court. And to then say that it shouldn't try to do that is again, as I said, to ridicule the Constitution. Okay, that I don't think there's a question about why we have a Supreme Court. The problem is, in this case, is that we have a group of people bringing these cases and passing these laws who don't care what the Supreme Court says unless it agrees with them. And this is where it all comes down to. So what I see as a larger problem about this whole issue is, on one hand, women's rights have been protected and expanded and protected again and expanded again and protected again until we got to the point where the simple preamble of the Declaration of Independence was sufficient justification for a legislative action that says, if a man threatens you, and you're a woman and a man threatens you, that's a crime. Because we all know that it's a bad thing for men to threaten women, okay? Well, the whole problem is, what does it mean to say they're threatened by a man? Okay? If you even buy into that equation, and basically the statement is saying if a man commits a crime against a woman, that's a crime. That's what it basically comes down to. What does it mean to be a crime or a criminal if the sheer fact that someone looks at you or follows you or is in your area or is in your neighborhood or works with you or something like that makes you feel threatened, makes you feel uncomfortable? What does that mean? It essentially means that any man who is or is doing something that makes a woman feel uncomfortable is a stalker, a criminal, okay? And it's not a question of whether or not the police think that that person is making the woman feel uncomfortable. It's not a question of whether the courts think the woman is feeling uncomfortable. It's a question of whether the woman herself feels that way. And certainly there's a large number of men who support this, and there's a large number of people who see this as an infringement upon our rights as individuals in a quite sensible manner. And there's also a large number of people who say, well, if we can criminalize the act of staring at somebody or looking at somebody or saying something to them and making that person feel uncomfortable and upset at the fact that they're being looked at or spoken to, or someone's near them or whatever, okay? If we can do that and make that a crime, why can't we do the same thing for abortion? I can see this argument now that people are saying we have a responsibility to speak up for these life forms inside of these women's bodies who cannot and do not have the ability to speak up for themselves. Okay, or to bring a case or court or file a complaint or argue an issue in court or bear witness. We have a responsibility to protect these people when someone says, I'm going to have an abortion that's going to cause this person's life to end, or even if they don't die from it, they certainly suffer, and that argument is right next to the first one. If once a woman decides that she has the right to complain about a man who makes her feel uncomfortable, threatened, scared, whatever, then certainly an unborn child in that woman's body has the same right to do that about a woman who makes her feel uncomfortable or threatened. Okay? And so there's little steps here, and then there's big steps. But the problem is that if a woman feels threatened by a man in and around, or that she knows, or tracking on the internet, or whatever whatever he's doing, the ultimate danger that she faces is being killed by this man. That's the ultimate danger that she faces. Okay, what's the next ultimate danger that she faces? Well, it's being tortured by this man and not actually dying. Certainly being put into slavery, into servitude to this man without actually being killed. Okay? What do you think a woman who's been raped and impregnated by a man is going to think, if she has to carry that man's baby to term and provide for its health, what is that but physical slavery? There's nothing else that you could describe it as. You might talk about, well, what this woman does or what the child does or whatever. And say, I'm listening to these people talking. They're like, well, this guy might cure, the child might cure cancer. The child might solve the global warming problem. We can't just have the woman decide in and of itself that she's going to kill this person. Well, the reality is we do this all the time. And we have a well-established legal right to do so. It's called the Castle Doctrine. If someone is threatening your house or your physical safety, trying to break into your house or your place of work, or I don't know, forget the other cases. There's two cases. There's your home, there's your place of work, or your car. Okay, if you're out in your car and someone's trying to break in your car and use force against, the protection that you have, they don't have to actually enter your house. All they have to be doing is using force and attempting to enter your house, your work, your vehicle. That is almost universal right to use lethal force. Okay, so there is certainly a long and broad precedent for the use of legal force for self-defense against somebody who is committing a crime against you, and is possible that they might be a life-threatening person or event to you. And what is physical slavery other than that? Okay, what is it other than that? If I put a chain or something around your body and restrain your body and force you to do X, Y, and Z at my command, that's slavery. That's kidnapping, slavery, and forcible. What's the word I'm looking for? I forget the word off the top of my head. But forcing somebody to do something that they wouldn't ordinarily do under the threat of force or violence. Okay, there's a legal term for that. I can't remember the name off the term off the top of my head, but certainly planting an embryo or what will be an embryo in a woman's body and demanding that she take care of that embryo and her through the next 9 months until that child is viable outside of the body, and then transferring that child to some responsible organization that will take care of it, not just leaving it on the sidewalk in front of a fire station or bundling it in a box and putting it in a church. That if that child dies as a result of her actions, that's murder. That is at the very least manslaughter, and certainly largely murder. That's the responsibility of having a child, an organism that can become a viable self-contained life form inside you that you are now responsible for. So the argument, in my opinion, totally fails to say that the state can prevent the woman from carrying a child to term, because that is in and of itself enslavement. If a man can get a woman pregnant and that child cannot be aborted, not even under conditions of rape, incest, or the risk of life or death of the mother, if there's no condition that child or that woman can have an abortion legally, then they are adding to the risk that men pose to women. And no man is innocent at that point. The one thing that having an exception for rape, incest, or life and death conditions in even some of these restrictive states that have, pretty much an abortion ban otherwise, is that it does allow the victim to end the issue. to end it, to escape it. They have a legal out. And what this does by totally banning abortion under any conditions is it forces, this is the state forcing the victim to consciously endure the slavery, the burden of raising that perpetrator's child, through nourishing that perpetrator's child in her own body for at least the time it takes for that child to be viable outside the womb. And it doesn't matter whether it's 5 months, 3 months, 2 weeks, or an hour. It's still slavery. Okay? You don't abuse somebody for a short period of time and then it's okay. It's still abuse. So to me, what the really interesting thing about this whole argument is that it creates this massive contradiction between these two sort of arms of rights and legal protections for half of the public, the female half, okay, which is by definition sexist, which is by definition a violation of, I believe it's the 14th or the 16th Amendment, that no law should be passed that's based upon sex, race, or religion, okay, while at the same time it further creates a hostile legal environment for the male half of the species. Now men have absolutely no argument. Any man who's capable of impregnating a woman or at least raping her or whatever or assaulting her or intimidating her or causing her to fear any of this, to fear it, whether he actually intends to do so or not, okay, whether he intends to intimidate her or not, they now have no defense. We as men in this country have no legal defense when it comes to women. It was bad enough already. And all I can think of is that these people have passed these laws because they are maniacally focused on life, on the right to life, and totally ignoring the reality of our government and our system of laws and law enforcement and the reality of life on this planet. Otherwise, they've forgotten entirely what that means and why abortion is so critical for the overall mental balance and stability of this country. If you want to have a Catholic country where nobody can have an abortion, go to a Catholic country where nobody can have an abortion. I don't understand why the Supreme Court of the United States would literally run away from its obligation to settle this issue in a sensible manner and at least protect the potential for having an abortion, at least for the first month or whatever. It's gonna come down now to basically, it really kind of makes me worried that at some point you're going to have people regularly test women to see if they're pregnant. We're going to bring you in for mandatory testing to see if you're pregnant. Certainly once they become physically able to actually conceive children. And so what happens when you start bringing 10, 11, 15, whatever year old women into an organization, a government organization or some kind of legal organization, and mandating that they're tested for pregnancies, that they have to provide proof that either they are still pregnant or they're not pregnant. And what does this mean? We test them on a daily basis? I mean, this is just crazy. So I think that these people have literally sort of brought out the reality of a simple problem, is that if you're really religious, is that a good thing? Is it a good thing to be religious? Is it a good thing to be a pro-lifer? Does that mean that perhaps you are a little bit too crazy to be making good decisions about life and the law in our society? And is this not exactly why we have federal courts, not leave everything up to individual states. And that's before we get to the last part of this, which really, in my opinion, is just insane. Okay? This whole thing about making it illegal for somebody to leave a state, go to another state, have an abortion, and come back. That's just crazy. Look, you want to talk about states' rights, okay? It doesn't mean they have the right to enforce their laws everywhere in the country. That's just nuts. If it's legal for somebody to have an abortion in New York State or Connecticut or Maryland or wherever, how can it possibly be a crime in Texas if that person leaves Texas and goes to Maryland and has an abortion and comes back? How can you call that states' rights? That's not states' rights. That's state dominion. That's every state declaring. And why only stop at abortion? Why not do this for any other crime in the state? You can't leave our state, go to commit a crime in another state, or go to commit what is a crime here in another state where it's not a crime, then come back here and not be subject to criminal prosecution. Why not do that for every crime? This whole, what I think is the silver lining, if anything, about this entire issue is that it exposes this vast hypocrisy and this vast tar pit upon which this country is based, is that people are willing to use the Constitution to accomplish an agenda, but don't understand how they destroy the entire country by having that agenda in the first place. So yeah, on top of that, aside from people, another way of people talking about how they're using the legal system and the legislature and the executive power or whatever to enact an agenda, but don't understand how that agenda is destroying the very country that has that system of government, which enables them, or at least I will say, at least enables them in the near term to do that. Then, if you look at these states turn around and pass laws that give people the right to carry firearms with no state review of them whatsoever. It's really interesting how these same people will then not cooperate with BATF when it comes to a firearms application, or whether they're transporting, purchasing, and carrying. That's what I'm looking for. Transport and purchase of firearms and ammunition by people who are prevented from doing so under federal law. They just don't even cooperate with the BATF when it comes to that. They don't pass these applications back to the government. They literally will go engage in these private sales to get around the gun applications, the background checks and so forth. We can't close that loophole at all. And now we got these people making the parts on the internet and selling them that are never registered. And it's just insane. At the same time, they'll talk about how these sanctuary cities and these, in the liberal states, how they don't cooperate with INS. Everybody's doing their little bit of thing to declare themselves above and beyond the law, the federal law. So, I guess we don't care about federal law as long as we feel like we have a good argument for not obeying it or not following it or not supporting it. So why do these people really even care about the Supreme Court decision? They could go right ahead and lock up anybody they think is guilty of committing an abortion or whatever, and the Supreme Court issued a decision, and their local state courts can just ignore it. Why even bother to worry about it? So, if you were part of this whole local states' right movement because you can't handle what the federal regulations and federal laws or federal decisions are, it on one sense, sure, this may be a change, okay? But it's not the first time that there's been a conflict between state and federal legislation and law and enforcement. It's hardly the first issue that this has happened. It won't be the last issue. But to me, every time that there is an issue, every time there is a conflict between state governments and federal governments, it just goes to show that people are happy to use the Constitution as an argument to support their position when the Constitution appears to support it. But as soon as the Constitution does not support their position, they'll declare that that state position is morally, ethically, and therefore legally superior to the Constitution and federal position. So there is no consistency from these people who don't deal with these conflicts consistently. They're just making up their own system, their own laws, their own policies, their own procedures, and following them, regardless of whatever else is going on. They're doing what the hell they want to do. And to me, that is the most scary part. You don't get the right to carry a firearm, even in a state with an open carry or shall issue policy of any kind. You don't get that right except by the fact that the legislator gave it to you. Okay, it's not like the government, state government, does not have that authority anymore. They have just abrogated that authority. There's a difference. I will tell you this as one last thing. This is where I was going with this. There's nothing that would scare me more than to live in a state where men are free to carry firearms, not just because they have compliance with state and federal law, but also because the state government just doesn't care to do a background check on them. Okay? How could you possibly be safe in an environment where someone you used to date or someone who works with you or someone who lives in your neighborhood is free to carry a firearm without any kind of background check whatsoever? Because the state has said, we are just going to grant the Second Amendment rights to everybody in our state, and we are stepping away from this issue entirely. How could you ever feel safe in such an environment, knowing that they could not only have a weapon, but they could also get you pregnant, and you wouldn't have any legal right to have an abortion? How could you ever feel safe in that environment? It just makes my mind shake to think that women are so worried about their self-defense on one hand, and yet actually pushing to weaken their own recourses to resolve a situation in which they've been victimized. I just don't get it. But hey, let's put it this way. No one's getting me pregnant. I don't really have to worry about Roe versus Wade. That's not my problem, okay? I know whatever happens in terms of gun laws in this country, that there always will be some people who will carry guns and violate the law and whistle every damn day on their way going through their normal lives. And there'll always be some people who even the idea that they might have a gun will cause a statewide flare-up of racism and prejudice. I mean, we know this very well throughout United States history. There's no question about that. Some people are going to be arrested almost on sight now because there's a very good chance that they might have a gun. They're on their way to commit a crime, or they're in the process of committing a crime, and no one else has done a background check on them. And if they show up at the wrong place, with the wrong skin color, they're wearing the wrong clothes, they're driving the wrong car, they can guarantee they're going to get at least detained and searched. Okay? It doesn't matter what DeSantis or whatever other Texas governor says. There's people in this country for whom it will always be a problem for them to have a gun. Okay? And there's people in this country who They will have guns. They will attempt to go through airports with them. It will happen multiple times, and people will smile and laugh, and the guy will continue to get on a plane and go back about his business. We've seen this happen time and time again, because this is not a country where justice is blind. It just is not. And yet we have people left and right, front and center, arguing that it is not racist, which is insane. Okay? But in this particular case, this is not my fight, my issue. Okay? It is not going to make things a lot worse for me, and it's never going to be better. Okay? It's that simple. I like I said, there are already enough issues that men have in this country with regards to women and their fears about men, that this is not going to move that needle hardly a bit. It's just going to just turn it off entirely. Any woman can now argue that she's worried about getting raped by somebody and not being able to have an abortion. Every woman can now say that's a legitimate concern. But it's not my problem today any more than it was last week or last month or last year. Okay? It's going to affect some men more than others, and it's going to affect some more men than it did before. But the real people who are losers in this entire argument are women. Unquestionably. And at some point, women are going to look up and say, what have we done? What have we let happen? And where can we possibly fix this problem? How can we possibly straighten out this mess? And I hope at least some of them are going to say, yes, it's a mess, but to a certain degree, we brought this on ourselves by asking for so much protection from our legislatures and our courts and our police, to the point where men just don't take us seriously anymore. They can't. They can't take us seriously anymore because we are constantly whining about how life is such a risk to us. And we need all these things. We need alimony, we need child support, all of the things that people ask for the government empowers the government to act in those areas. And you've just given every state the right to decide your life. And yeah, they can argue that you didn't give it to them. It's always been there. It's just that they're deciding to actually use it. So that raises another question, which I think is a troubling question for everybody, no matter what. It does raise the question of, where does this actually end? Where does this stop? If we can write the Constitution, we can have the Declaration of Independence, and yet the government still encroaches upon our individuality in the name of protecting other individuals from protecting one group of individuals from another group of individuals, and ultimately in terms of protecting the state from the people. Okay. You can argue in some ways it protects the people from the state, but it's really more like -1 plus 80. Okay. The state is still deciding the fate of the individual. It's just that it's deciding it in a different way than it did last week or last year. It still reserves the ultimate power to decide. Okay. And the courts ultimately cannot really go against a legislative decision, because it isn't a clearly defined constitution or limit of the Constitution. It is an ad hoc limit, because ultimately every right that we have based upon the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence is restricted. There are no unrestricted rights that the people have. And at some level, we end up in a situation where the legislature can decide that it makes sense, and they can write arguments to say it makes sense for this particular right or that particular right or whatever particular right to be restricted. And the Supreme Court cannot reject that argument. It can only issue a relativity decision and saying that this goes too far, or that goes too far, or this is too broad, or whatever. But it can't reject the argument in and of itself. And ultimately, always the legislature can argue that not only is it the people's will, it's a legislative action, it's the people's will, but also that it's required to combat crime. Okay. That there is a problem with crime in this area, problem with crime in that area. And the Supreme Court cannot disempower legislative bodies in the pursuit of law and order. I don't think there is a single argument that anybody can make today that says you have the right to free speech to the point where it starts becoming a problem for public safety. Okay? And it's this you can take any issue you want out of that. Instead of talking about free speech, you can talk about any issue. Okay? When it becomes a threat to public safety, that's where that right will be curtailed, right there. So the bigger wraparound of this whole thing is, where is the government bounded in terms of its control and invasion of privacy of the public, of the individual? If they can say, well, abortion is murder of a fetus, is a human being, a life form, they can say all these things, whether or not they are scientifically true, they can still say them. Okay. And the point is that it doesn't necessarily have to be a scientific truth, as long as it's a legal truth, as long as it's a finding of fact of the justices or the judiciary court involved in the situation. They can declare it to be a finding of judicial fact and act upon it. So the ultimate problem is that there's really nothing about the human condition that the legislature, for one, the courts, second, and third, the executive branch, in the name of carrying out the laws that are written by the legislature and the court decisions that are written are made by the judiciary. Nothing to stop any of these people from doing whatever they think is necessary. And to me, the real problem with that is it is right up the alley of the anarchist anti-government arguments, that no matter how much good a government system does, at some point it does too much bad to be tolerated.